Hello, all. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning if you're watching this in the morning, and welcome to the Goddess Project podcast. My name is Carla Ionescu, and I'm your host as always. If you're new to this podcast, welcome. If you've been here for a while or since the beginning, hello, hello, hello. I'm very excited this week. We're going to be talking about Circe, and I find it super interesting that I put her on my list to do as a podcast when I made my lineup for season one. And then I ended up reading Madeline Miller's book, which I wasn't planning on, but couldn't find anything that I wanted to read. And so this one came along. I mean, I had planned on reading it. No, to be fair, I had planned on reading it at some point. I actually had it in my phone downloaded, but I wasn't emotionally prepared. She had killed me with the Song of Achilles. And I thought, oh my God, I have to be emotionally prepared for her work. And I finished it in about a week or so because it was so great. And I really wanted to talk about Circe from the beginning as a character that doesn't get enough credit. And I think Madeline Miller did a fantastic job bringing her into popular culture and bringing her into perhaps a readership that maybe wasn't looking at Circe in the way that she comes off in this book. And she also gave her a fantastic ending, although Max Dashu and I might disagree. So if you know the scholar Max Dashu, she is a fantastic, a foundational scholar, I would say. Her work, her website, I think it's called Suppressed Histories. Don't quote me. I'm sorry. I'm terrible with names, but you can find her just by Googling her. And I don't remember how we got into some kind of a Facebook conversation about books and about something to do with women and figurines. And oh, I remember she posted a picture of Persephone with a torch and a snake. Anyways, and I had asked her, we started talking about the torch and the snake and who carries torches and snakes. And I had asked her if she'd read Circe, since the torch is sort of Hecate's torch as well, and the torch of witches. Anyways, and she did not like the ending. She was like, oh, she just domesticated her and gave her a husband and a kid. And then I thought, yeah, actually, that's true. So I really admire Max a lot for all of her work and also for her abruptness in naming the things she does or does not like. In historically speaking, Circe is an immortal, and as far as we know, she does not ever really settle down. I say it in quotations. She does have children. I suppose she doesn't really have a husband. And like I said, she's immortal, and so she goes on. But and there are cults to Circe, which we're going to talk about. But it's fascinating. So I think that Madeline Miller has a different take on a lot of Circe's relationships. So I'm not going to give away anything that's not historically out there already. So the fact that, Circe has children and that she has some domesticity, that's sort of in the myth and in the stories and in the Odyssey and things like that. But the twist I think that Madeline Miller gives her, I think, is really good. Anyways, I'm not going to ruin it for you if you haven't read the book, but I am going to tell you the story. So I should really give you a heads up. So if you want to read the book and not know anything about the story of Circe, then this may not be the podcast for you, or the time for this podcast may not be for you. For me, I went in already knowing the history. And so this is why because the history is a bit open-ended, I was hesitant. When you read the Song of Achilles, you already kind of know what happens and you know how it ends. And so I was prepared for that. But for Circe, there is a lot of open-endedness and you could take it in many ways. Her life. I'm going to tell you some of the primary sources of her life and her, of the telling of her life and her story and all those things. But you could really take it anywhere because she really doesn't have an ending per se. And so, or even really a set narrative. There's sort of what's understood, and then there's all this side story that could be put in there, which I think historical fiction writers are fantastic at doing, especially when they do their research, like Madeline Miller has. And so I don't think it's going to ruin the book for you, but if you don't want to know anything, I will be talking about Odysseus and Circe. I'll be talking about Medea and Circe. I'll be talking about Circe's other lovers as well, and her children, things like that, right? So just a heads up if you don't want to know anything. But I will not be talking about the plot twists of the book at all. And so that hopefully is fair enough. Yeah, for everyone who wants to continue. I highly recommend. I know that Max and I may disagree on some of the ways that the story took place. And that's okay. That's perfectly wonderful, actually. And I think that there are people, when we're talking about historical fiction, there are people that disagree on the turns that authors take, because authors do take liberties, and that's their job. I really like the liberties that Madeline Miller took. But I understand Max's hesitation. Yeah. Because Circe is such a powerful female figure and a witch figure, which is why this episode is titled Circe, the Witch That Could, because I think that she is a witch that survives, survives everything, survives, of course, numerous men, numerous generations, numerous biases against witches. So she is a survivor, and her witchcraft, let me think about it, how to put this. Her witchcraft does not negatively impact her life. So let's begin at the beginning. Circe was a goddess of sorcery. In Greek, the word for that is pharmakeia, which is also sometimes associated with magic, but most importantly and fascinatingly is associated with pharmacy. That's where our word pharmacy comes from. And that word pharmacy or pharmaceutical also comes from a mixing of potions in a way, mixing of minerals and vitamins and herbs and all of that sort of thing, for the purpose of either healing or killing. And so this idea of pharmakeia or sorcery or magic is deeply connected to Circe, and of course the Hecate, which I'm very excited to say we'll be talking about in season 2. But Circe, I would say Circe is probably the second most famous witch or user of pharmakeia, next to Hecate. And as we'll see, sometimes she's associated or called her daughter. Hecate is often referred to as Circe's mother. So Circe is the goddess of sorcery. She's skilled in magic, transmutation, which is my favorite. And we're going to be talking a lot about transmutation, transformation, illusion, and necromancy. So necromancy is, of course, the raising of the dead. And so imagine the power that Circe holds. Okay, so transmutation, which is changing bodies, changing people into other things, changing humans, or changing actually one thing into another. That's really the definition of that. And illusion and necromancy. I mean, it's the trinity of witchcraft power. No offense to white witches who are probably watching this podcast and saying, stop saying that about witches. Yeah. As a side note, I got into a conversation with a friend of mine about witches, and we talked a lot about Sabrina the Teenage Witch, if you watch that show on Netflix, and which I love the show, but one of the things that really irked me was this association with witches and Satan, and this constant sort of flip of wording and of everything. And so that was really a pet peeve. Like, I was almost shouting at the TV every time that they said, something that was very, like hail Satan or oh my Satan or some stupid stuff like that. And then I can go on about that forever. And so sometimes when I talk about witches and I use a lot of these sort of terminologies like necromancy and transmutation, which are the realm of witches, but I don't want, and the reason why I say white witches are probably yelling at me, I don't want the idea to be that witches, I don't want to propagate the stereotype that witches are all into what we might consider today negative, bad, evil things. And so, because I really like witches, in fact, I tend to lean towards witchcraft nowadays more than ever, as far as sort of a practice of healing. And moon bathing and goddess bathing and all of these kinds of things are sort of coming up for me right now. And maybe that's why I'm relating to Circe in this way. Because if you ask me as an undergrad about her, perhaps if you asked any academic, 15 years ago as an undergrad or more, about Circe, she really was sort of ignored. I don't know if ignored, but just kind of put aside as, the witch that seduces Odysseus for a year and doesn't let him go. And there's been a movement of a revival, and I'm caught up in that revival because I really connect to her at this point in my life, perhaps. And it looks like a lot of other women and perhaps even men, or, however you identify, are also connecting to Circe now. Yeah. And perhaps it's because she's been brought forward, like I said, by this book, but also I think because we have a different relationship with witchcraft. We come out of the Harry Potter generation, and we're willing to understand that magic and pharmakeia and sorcery and whatever you want to call it are not absolutes. They're not absolutely negative or absolutely sort of demonic or absolutes in some way. So that's very exciting. It's a very exciting time for witches, I think. So Circe's name derives from the Greek verb circo or kirko, or kirku, meaning to secure with rings or hoop around, or circu. Yeah. A reference to the binding power of magic, right? So her name is connected to this idea of binding something. And when you transmute something, or even in necromancy, when you raise the dead, you, in theory, bind two things together, or bind energies together, or create some type of binding or hooping together. And so that's where her name comes from. She had an island in Aiaia, which was located in the far west, near the earth encircling river Oceanus. Her brother Aeetes, a realm, is in the far east and was similarly named just Aiaia. So Circe is a mythical sorceress. Homer calls her fair-locked, that she had fair hair. So he calls her a fair-locked goddess. He says that she's the daughter of Helios and the Oceanid Perse, and sister of Aeetes. Now, it's really interesting because, like I said, other people claim that she is also the daughter of Hecate, and or she could be the daughter of Hecate. And in fact, Circe has a really interesting parentage, which actually we're going to talk about next. Actually, let's talk about that next. Let me move to the slides of parentage. Okay, so she lives in this island named Aiaia. Then later Odysseus comes and visits the island, which we're going to talk about that. But her descent is different. Her ancestry is differently described by poets. Some call her the daughter of Hyperion and Europe. That's Orpheus. Others say that she is the daughter of Aeetes and Hecate. And so the most commonly accepted origins or parentage of Circe is that she is the daughter of Helios and Perse, and her brother is Aeetes. But some people have said that she is the daughter of Aeetes and Hecate. Yeah. Now, according to Hesiod, she becomes the mother of Agrius, which is Odysseus' son, and she has two more children by him as well. The most famous one, of course, is Telegonus. or telegonous. So where does she come from? Yeah. Oh, sorry, we're on the parentage. I'm going to read to you a couple of primary sources. Circe, a goddess of braided hair. So this will become a theme over and over again. The fact that she braids her hair. Okay. With human speech. So this actually refers to the idea that she doesn't have the voice of the gods. The gods have a voice that make you cower, or that awe you, or that human beings, when they hear the voice of God, you know, they have all these reactions. They go deaf, they fall on their knees, they start to cry, whatever. But she has a human voice. And in fact, that's one of the complaints against her by the gods, that she sounds too much like humans. So that sets her aside. Okay. So she has braided hair, human speech, strange powers, according to Homer. Baleful Aeetes was her brother, and both were radiant Helios's, the sun god's children. Their mother is Perses, Oceanus' daughter. Other sources say that the Colchians, who were ruled by Aeetes, the son of Helios and Perses, and brother to Circe, and Minos' wife, Pasiphae. Ugh. So this is another source that says not only is she the sister of Aeetes, but also the sister of Pasiphae. And Pasiphae, if you don't know, is the mother of the Minotaur. She was married to King Minos of Crete, and she gave birth to the Minotaur. A later translation says that Circe is Hecate's daughter, okay, and that she is married to Aeetes and says that Hecate is married to Aeetes and has two daughters, Circe and Medea. Okay. So I think because Circe and Medea, as we'll talk about, are very interconnected, and Medea is also associated with sorcery, although in a much more negative and violent way. In fact, Medea is next for us. We're going to talk about her next week. And so Circe and Medea become associated in such a way almost that to some they appear as sisters. And as we move forward into sort of Roman history and Roman writers, Circe and Medea often are associated as sisters, and then their parents become, like I said, Hecate's and Aeetes. So her parentage is interesting, but needless to say, I do want to say that Circe's actually, I made a note of her heritage, right? She is the granddaughter of 4 titans. She's the niece to the moon and sunrise. Blessed by the golden rays of her father Helios, she doesn't have any of the enticements or goddess-given beauties by her nymph mother. So she's not depicted as God-voiced, and often she's said to not be as beautiful or have a god beauty. Although, as we see others describe her, she is quite beautiful because she is still an immortal. Yeah. So it's her voice, really, and her ungod-like behavior. Yeah. She's often referred to, but the gods often refer to her of squawking like a bird. Yeah. And there is sort of a Latinized form of the Greek Circe or Kirke, which possibly used to mean bird, according to some scholars, but that's a little bit unclear. So let's talk about her island. Okay, I call it an island, a garden, and beasties. This is one of my favorite image of Circe. If you've ever seen, you've probably come across it. You know, she's walking around topless among lions and wolves, and she's on the stairs, sort of weaving magic. It's one of my favorite images of her because really, it's like a dream life, in the sense that what woman doesn't want to be on her own island with nymphs? Okay, sometimes. With lions as pets and wolves as pets, and all the animals are pets. She grows her garden. She spends her day creating herbs and, drawing and, of course, weaving. The Daedalus does give her a special kind of, what do you call it? It's not a helm. The thing that you weave on. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a brain freeze right now. But so she does do some weaving and she does do all of these things, but she spends a lot of her time in the garden, and she spends a lot of her time just chilling and, hanging out with her animals and living her best life. Yeah. So her island of Aiaia. So we're told by Hesiod that Circe comes to the island over and against Tyrrhenia on the chariot of Helios. Okay. And he called it Hesperian because it lies towards the west. Okay. Other sources say, for example, in the Argonautica, we have Aeetes who addresses the Argonauts, and he says, I myself was whirled along in the chariot of my father Helios the sun when he took my sister Circe to the western land. And we reached the coast of Tyrrhenia, where she lives far, far indeed from Colchis. And then there's a Valerius Flaccus, which is another source in the Argonautica 7. He talks about Circe was born away from the land of Colchis by winged dragons. Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. So, and she's often talked about as a she dragon. Now, we talked about in the past how dragons and snakes kind of overlap symbolically. And so she is sometimes associated with serpent or serpent-like figures. But in this case, a lot of the use of the word dracons or dragons comes up. And so she is carried by dragons, and sometimes she's referred to as a she dragon. Yeah. So she's living her best life on this island. I was going to talk about the book, but no, I promised you I wouldn't. She's living her best life on this island. Her father takes her to this island, and she has everything there. She has a palace. She has animals. Like I said, she has gardens. She's got everything. And the most fascinating thing about it all, I think, is that if she doesn't have anything or something, a thing, she learns how to transmute it, how to create it, right? So she's a goddess of alchemy. She's a goddess, obviously, of sorcery, like we've talked about. And so she learns how to change things into the thing that she's missing or the thing that she needs. And so she's really a magical, sort of independent, immortal, beautiful by human standards. Okay, the gods might not think she's fantastic, but every human recognizes her divinity or her deity. And so she's living her best life. She's living her best life. All right. So let's talk about her and Medea and the act of purging bloody crimes. So I thought that I would give you a little bit of the story from Argonautica 4 because the depiction of it is so interesting. And so I thought I'd read you a little bit of this. So the Argonauts come to the famous haven of Aiaia. Yeah, came to the famous haven of Aiaia. And they tie their boat to the shore, and here they find Circe bathing her head in salt water. So again, she's spending her days just bathing herself in the sea. Yeah. She had been terrified, Circe, by a nightmare in which she saw all the rooms and walls of her house streaming with blood and fire devouring all of the magic drugs with which she used to bewitch her visitors. But she managed to put out the red flames with the blood of a murdered man, gathering it up in her hands, and so the horror passed. And then when the morning came, she rose from her bed, and now she was washing her hair and clothes in the sea, trying to wash away the nightmare of the night before. A number of creatures were whose ill-sorted limbs declared them to be neither man nor beast, had gathered around her like a great flock of sheep, following their shepherd from the fold. And so already by the time that Jason arrives there with Medea, she has already transformed or transmuted people, assumingly men, because those were her favorite to transmute, because they really were the ones to really threaten her peace. Threaten her peace. And she changed them into half animal, half beasts. So already by the time Jason gets there, she has long been in the practice of transmutation. The Argonauts were dumbfounded by the scene. Okay. But a glance at Circe's form and eyes convinced them all that she was the sister of Aeetes. So even though she's said to not have her mother's beauty, whatever that means, she does look just like her brother, which then makes no sense of why her brother is seen as this beautiful, stunning, godly man, but she's not supposed to be. Anyways. As soon as she had dismissed the fears and then engendered by her dream, Circe set out for home. But as she left, she invited the young men to come with her, beckoning them in her own seductive way. Yeah. Jason told them all to take no notice, so they stayed where they were. But he himself decided, and he took Medea with him, that they would go to her house or her palace. I prefer to call it a palace, but okay. Circe, at a loss to know why they'd come, invited them to sit in chairs, and without a word, they made for the hearth and sat down there after the manner of suppliants in distress. Medea hid her face in her hands. Jason fixed in the ground his great hilted sword, with which he had killed Absyrtus. And neither of them looked her in the face. So she knew something was wrong. Okay, so she knew they were fugitives with murder on their hands, and took the course laid down by Zeus, the god of suppliants. I always think supplicants, but suppliants, who heartedly abhors the killing of a man unless he's doing it, and yet as heartedly befriends the killer. So she sets about the rites by which a ruthless slayer is absolved when he seeks asylum at the hearth. Okay, so this is a practice or a ritual that she's already quite familiar with, and of course, so are Jason and Medea. First, to atone for the unexpiated murder, she took a suckling pig from a sow with dugs still swollen after littering. Okay. Holding it over them, she cuts his throat and let the blood fall on their hands. Next, she propitiated Zeus with other libations, calling on him as the cleanser who listens to a murderer's prayers with friendly ears. Then her attendants, the naiads and nymphs who did her housework, carried all the refuse out of doors. But she herself stayed by the hearth, burning cakes and other wineless offerings with prayers to Zeus, in hopes that she might cause the loathsome Erinyes, or the Furies that we talked about last week, to relent. Remember that the Furies, or the Erinyes, are chasing any type of family murder. And of course, Medea and Jason had just murdered their family member. And so she prays and hopes that they are forgiven. When all was done, she raises up, seats them in polished chairs, and takes a seat nearby where she could watch their faces. And she begins to ask them to tell her what brought them overseas, and then what port they went to, and why they sought asylum at her hearth, all of this stuff. Horrible memories of her dream come back to her as she wondered what was coming, and she waited eagerly to hear a king's woman's voice as soon as the girl had looked up from the ground and noticed her eyes. For the children of Helios were easy to recognize even from a distance by their flashing eyes, which shot out rays of golden light. So she recognizes that Medea is a family member to her. Medea, daughter of Aeetes, the black-hearted king, answered all her aunt's questions, so that's her niece, speaking quietly in the Colchian tongue. She told her of the quest and voyage of the Argonauts, of their stern ordeal, and how she herself had been induced to sin by her unhappy sister and had fled from her father's tyranny with precious sons. But she said nothing of the murder of Absyrtus, not that Circe was deceived. Nevertheless, she felt some pity for her weeping niece. Poor girl, she says, you have indeed contrived yourself a shameful and unhappy homecoming, for I am sure you will not long be able to escape your father's wrath. The wrongs you have done are intolerable, and soon he will be in Hellas to avenge his son's murder. However, since you are my suppliant and kingswoman, I will not add to your afflictions now that you are here. But I do demand that you should leave my house, you that have linked yourself to this foreigner, whoever he may be, this man of mystery, whom you have chosen without your father's consent. And do not kneel to me at my hearth, for I never will approve your conduct and your disgraceful flight. Medea's grief when she heard this was more than she could bear. She drew her robe across her eyes and waited till Jason took her by the hand and led her out of doors, shivering with fear. Thus they left Circe's house. So I find that story really interesting because of two reasons. Number one, Circe's ability to purge the bloody crime. Okay. And so she has divine authority and recognition by Zeus to purge the crime. Second, she purges their crime because they come sit at the hearth. So it's part of that sort of hosting, right? This famous hosting ritual. And she recognizes, of course, that they've committed this crime and they're asking for this forgiveness. And she does so without hearing the details of the crime. And in fact, when reading this story, she never hears the details of the crime. And so in many ways, Circe is the cleanser, the salvation, the tool through which to gain salvation, which is really fascinating for these two. And because she purges their crimes, they are able then to move on freely. So the Furies are no longer after them. They don't carry the blood debt or the family debt of killing a family member. And so they then are free to go on their way. So Circe is a really fascinating figure already in the Argonaut story, because she's already done something that is unique, of course, to the gods, but unique in the sense that she really didn't ask them for anything in return for this ritual. And she really didn't question them, other than, of course, telling Medea, what you've done is wrong. This is not going to end well for you. And I really don't want you to be in my space. Yeah. You bringing your bad energy into my good energy island. And I spent a lot of time building the positive energy. And even before you came here, I had this horrible nightmare. So your bad vibes are bleeding into my good vibes. And so I want you to go away now and take your bad vibes with you. But I have absolved you of your sins. Okay. And have purged you of the blood on your hands. So go and be happy. Yeah. We all know, of course, that, or maybe you don't know yet, we'll save that for next week, that Medea doesn't end up too happy. But that has nothing to do with Circe. Yeah. So as we'll see, one of Circe's favorite pastimes is turning men into beasts. And it is unclear from the primary source, at least, why she enjoys turning men into beasts. I mean, one can only imagine. But before, like I said, before the Argonauts get there and before Odysseus get there, and, you know, her reputation precedes her, which means in a way that at least some of the sailors that arrived on her island that were not turned into beasts lived to tell the tale and told the tale to other people. So again, one of the things that I found really fascinating about this is that here we have another female divinity that turns men into something. So remember, we looked at Medusa, who turns men into stone. And in this way, Circe decides to turn them into beasts. Now, most famously, we have turning men into pigs, which ironically remains sort of a joke, or I don't know, a stereotype of men. Is that right? You know, that all men are pigs, or that men are pigs, or some men are pigs, or whatever. So it's kind of interesting that that terminology lasts into today. But as we'll see, some of her transformations are more fantastical than that. And my favorite part is that some of her transformations are actually part transformations, which means that the individual, the man, is either half beast, half man. So lower body turns into beast, upper body stays man, or more often than not, the upper body is turned into a beast so that they're not able to voice or speak. And the lower body, or like the hands and feet, remain human. So some really fascinating transmutation here that happens here. And in fact, one of my notes, actually in my notes, was to talk about this idea of women who transform, or witches who transform men. And so, you know, fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast, right? And in the Beast is transformed into half beast. The upper half of him is a beast, although he does still maintain his speaking abilities. And the bottom half of him is kind of like human, anthropomorphized. And so that was a witch's curse. Or men that turn into frogs, or men that turn into mice, or whatever. And in fact, even in Harry Potter, now that I think of it, I can't remember the spell. You guys probably remember them more than me, but you can transform a person into a human into an animal. So if any of you know that spell's name off the top of your head, please put in the comments, or send it to me, because it's gonna bug me, until I look it up. So there is this just transformation and this tradition of transformation that harkens back to Circe as being sort of the originator of all of that category of shifting, particularly for men. Yeah, turning men into hideous animals is a pastime of witches. Certainly, they're accused of doing that for the last, 3,000 years. We come to Circe and Odysseus. Now, the story time for Circe and Odysseus is so long, okay, because the story is so long that Homer tells, that I thought that I would just tell you a little bit of, just a little bit. I'm going to summarize the story for you guys with some pertinent aspects of it, because we might be here way too long. Yeah. So Odysseus also lands on the island, of course. And also her, like I said, her reputation precedes her. And the interesting thing about the way that Homer describes her, he says that Odysseus comes to the island of Aiaia, where Circe dwelt, a goddess with braided hair, human speech, and strange powers. Yeah. And of course, Homer mentions again the parents, which is Aeetes, who was seen as a magician, interestingly, not a sorcerer, but anyways. And Helios is her father, and her mother's Perse. Yeah. And we're told that Odysseus lands there and kind of sits on the beach for a while. And then dawn comes, a couple of days, 3 days later, and he says, listen, we got to do something. We're just kind of sitting here. Let's split up into two groups. One group will stay here, and the other group will go and see the goddess Circe. Okay. So he says, I divided my crew into two companies and gave each its leader. I myself captain one, and then Eurylochus the other. And then they drew lots. Okay. And Eurylochus was the one chosen to go. So Odysseus sits back on his boat while his comrade and half his group go to see Circe. Okay. And so when this group gets there, this is when we see the description. So outside the palace were lions and mountain wolves that she had herself bewitched by giving them magic drugs, or so these men thought. The beasts did not set upon my men. This is Odysseus speaking. They reared up instead and fawned on them with their long tails. Okay, as dogs will fawn around the master when he comes home. Okay. Then there were lions, wolves. Okay. Everybody was circling along around his comrades. The sight of these strange creatures scared his people. Yeah. And then they saw the goddess with the braided hair. She was singing with her beautiful voice, and she moved to and fro as though she was dancing in a delicate, gleaming, delectable goddess dance. Okay. She was singing her song and blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then they try and speak to her. They call out and make themselves heard, or they try to call out and make themselves heard. The goddess ushers them in, gives them all seats, gives them food, wine, blah, blah, blah. And then, yeah, all these things she had mingled with pernicious drugs to make them forget their own court country utterly. Okay. And then she strikes them with her wand. So another fascinating aspect here is that she has a wand. Yeah? She has a wand. And she strikes them with her wand, and they begin to turn. Okay. They turn from men to swine, the snout and grunt and bristles. Only their minds were left unchanged. So this really is the stuff of nightmares, because you are now have become an animal with a human mind. Then they started crying, right? She puts them in a pig pen. They started crying. And she's giving them some corn and some acorns, daily food for shrine. But the leader, the team captain, Eurylochus, didn't drink the wine and wasn't turned. So he was able to return back to the ship and talk about their dismal fate. Okay. And so he comes back and he tells the story. And of course, all the men that are back at the ship are frightened. And then Odysseus says, listen, I need to go. I need to save the men. I can't just be sitting here. And as he's getting ready, his men are like, don't go, don't go. As he's getting ready, Hermes comes down, and Hermes speaks to him and tells him what to do. He says, so Odysseus says, Hermes came down to me and seized my hand, and he said, luckless man, lol, Why are you walking alone over these hills in a country you do not know? Your comrades are over there in Kirky's ground. They're turned to swine, lodged and safely penned in the sights. Yeah. Is your errand to rescue them? I warn you, you will never return yourself. You will only be left with the others there. Yet no, I am ready to save you from all the hazards, ready to keep you unscathed. Look, here is a herb of magic virtue. Take it and enter Circe's house with it. Then the day of then the day of evil never will touch your head. I will tell you of all the witch's arts. She will brew a potion for you, but with good things she'll also mingle some drugs. Yet even so, she will not be able to enchant you because my gift of magic herb will thwart her. I will tell you the rest point by point. When she strikes you with her long wand that she has, draw the keen sword from beside your thigh, push upon her and make it as if you're going to kill her. She will shrink back and then ask you to sleep with her. Okay. At this, you must let her have her way. She is a goddess. Accept her bed so that she may release your comrades and make you her cherished guests. But first, make her swear to the great oath of the blessed ones by the river Styx to plot no mischief to you thenceforward. If not, while you lie naked there, she may rob you of courage and of your manhood. I mean, so basically, go into her house. Okay, you have this thing that it's going to protect you from the herb. Drink her wine, eat her food, blah, blah. As she goes to turn you, she won't. Then put the sword at her neck as though you're about to kill her, and she will ask you to have sex with her. I sigh in Homer. Yeah. But okay. So Odysseus does all of this. Yeah. He goes in, all of this comes to pass. So I'm going through the story much quicker. All of this comes to pass. He sits down, he eats, he drinks, but he doesn't fall prey to her spell. And then she recognizes him as him. She says, "You must surely be the man of the wide-ranging spirit, Odysseus himself, the radiant one, at which I lulled, the radiant one, of the golden wand of Hermes. Hermes has told me of you. He always said that Odysseus would come to me on his way from Troy in his dark and rapid vessel." Okay. So now then she says, okay, enough of this. She's your sword and let us go to bed together. So everything pans out exactly as Hermes says. But as she spoke this, Odysseus answered her, "Circe, how can you ask me to show you gentleness? In this very house, you've turned my comrades into swine. And now that you have me here also, you ask me in your treacherousness to enter your room and lie with you." So he basically asks her for a vow that if I do have sex with you, you will return my men to themselves. And you need to swear this by the river Styx. And so she does. She says, I will do this. If you have sex with me, I will turn your comrades back and I will not turn you into anything. So they go and they have sex and it's wonderful. And then, the nymphs come around and they wash him and they bathe him and he sits down and eats and all this kind of stuff. Okay. And he's sitting there eating and he's unhappy. So Circe asks, "Odysseus, why do you sit there tongue-tied, eating your heart out, not touching your food or drink? Can it be that you fear some further treachery? I mean, I gave you my word." And he says, "Well, Circe, what man of righteous thoughts could bring himself to taste the food or drink before winning liberty for his friends and seeing the men before his eyes?" So he basically says, I don't really want to eat and enjoy your company and do all of these things until you change my men back, and they should be changed now. So Circe goes out in the hall. She flings the doors open. She sets the men back into their human selves, and they're super happy and they hug Odysseus and he's the hero and blah, blah, blah. And she goes even one step further and she goes, "I know you've got men on the ship. Why don't you ask them to come in? I already swore that I'm not going to hurt anybody. And so go and get the rest of your men and let's all stay here and enjoy ourselves." And Odysseus does that. He goes back to the ship. And of course, you can imagine that Eurylochus, who was originally there, is saying, "What is this nonsense? You don't believe her." So he doubts, Odysseus. And then him and Odysseus almost have a little brawl over it because Odysseus is a man with a big ego. Anyways, and they all eventually go and they stay with her and she tells them that they're safe and all of these things. And then they decide to stay for a year. They decide to stay for a year and spend basically a year in her island with her food in her palace with her animals and her wine and all that stuff. Okay. So, I mean, in many ways, Homer makes it seem as though she traps them on this island for a year. But frankly, it doesn't seem to be much of an entrapment. And certainly it seems like if it is an entrapment, it's certainly a very luxurious one. Okay. And so then after a year has passed, Odysseus says, they're sitting in bed one morning, one night, etc. And he says, Circe, you gave me once your promise to help me home, and the time has come to make it good. My own desire is set in that way, and the desire of my comrades also. They are there around me, vexing my heart with their lamentation when once you yourself are out of sight. So they're always asking me to go home, and it's time for me to go home. So she says, okay, you can go home. But then first you have to go to Hades. And there's this whole scene where Odysseus has to go to Hades and she tells him what to do. Sorry. And he has to go to the underworld and he has to survive that. And at first he's very frightened by it, but then he's like, okay, fine, I'll go do it. It is right there as he's getting ready to go to Hades that one of his friends falls off the roof of the house, Elpenor, and he dies. But anyway, that's a bit of a side note. And then he goes to the underworld, right? He goes and he follows what she says and he returns. Yeah. And they arrive back on her island. Yeah. And she sees them right away and she comes. And again, she feeds them. She gives them lots of meat and bread and all this kind of things. And then she starts warning. She goes, okay, now you're ready to go home. So I'm going to warn you about a couple of things. So she warns them about the sirens. And she warns them about Scylla and about Charybdis. And she tells them all of this. And she tells them, of course, about Helios's cows. She basically plans his entire journey and how he's going to survive it. So like literally step by step, point by point. So you're going to reach here and you're going to do this and you're going to get through it like this. And if you follow this advice and if you do A, B, and C, you'll be fine. And then from there, you're going to go here. And if you do A, B, and C, you'll be fine. So she does this for him, all of this for him. And before he leaves, yeah, some of it he does listen to, but with Helios cows, he doesn't really listen to her. So this is the day that he leaves. He says, scarcely had she ended her words when the dawn appeared in her flowery cloth of gold. Then queenly Circe took her way back across the island. Dawn, sorry. I went to my ship and told my comrades to go abroad and loose the hawsers. They embarked forthwith, sat at the thwarts, and grouped in order dipped their oars in the whitening sea. And Circe of the braided tresses, the goddess of awesome powers and of human speech, sent the best of comrades after our dark power vessel, our following breeze to fill our sails. So she sent her wind friends. We made fast the tackling everywhere, then seated ourselves while wind and helmsman bore the ship forward on her course. Then with heavy heart, I spoke to my comrades thus. Friends, it is not right that only one man or only two should know the divine decrees that Lady Circe has uttered to me. So all the things she told me, I will tell you of them, so that in full knowledge we may die, or in full knowledge escape, it may be, from death and doom. So he then tells, of course, his comrades as he leaves, and they move forward. So the story of Circe and Odysseus is an interesting one. It is interesting because it, of course, portrays the transformation that we talked about of the men at first. But it is interesting because there certainly doesn't seem to be any entrapment. Odysseus certainly seems to be sitting there willingly. And then she has him do these heroic deeds, for example, going to the underworld and bringing and speaking to those that are in the underworld. And he does see some of the Greeks that died. He actually sees Agamemnon and realizes that Agamemnon was killed by Clytemnestra when he got home. And Achilles, and he sees lots of people there. And then he comes back to the island and then he's told, he's given a plan. And so in many ways, Circe plays a key role in Odysseus getting home. Yes, okay, she takes away a year from him. I mean, Calypso takes away 7 later, but Circe really has zero. It seems to me she has zero malevolence towards him. His men, but towards him, she certainly is treating him in the same ways as the others until she realizes that he's Odysseus, and then she asks him to stay. So very, very interesting understanding of Circe. But when you read the primary text, you kind of get to see that she's really just helping him out, and he is kind of willingly, I think, staying there for a year. But you may feel differently. Perhaps you may feel that he's trapped there for some, enjoying the luxuries of a beautiful woman in her palace. Speaking of transformation, Aeschylus, the playwright, the Greek playwright, wrote a play called Circe. Of course, it's a lost play. But one of the most awesome parts of that tragedy is that Aeschylus had these satyrs in the play. So the story, she has the story of Circe, which is the story of Circe and Odysseus and the encounter. But there's a vase painting actually that's from the fifth century BCE that suggests that Odysseus's half transformed animal men formed the chorus in place of the usual satyrs. And so there's this really fascinating, and people in the ancient world were really fascinated again with this concept of transmutation or transformation. So I promised you that Circe had children by Odysseus. Let me just go back here. So during their union, Circe and Odysseus brought about the creation of 3 sons. Now, it is unclear how Circe can have 3 sons in 1 year, but okay. Agrius, Latinus, and of course, Telegonus, all of whom would become famous like their father. However, it is Telegonus, the youngest, who would become the ill-fated offspring that kills his father. Of course, ironically, it fulfills Odysseus' fate, a foreshadowed story that he'd been warned of years before. Perhaps it was divine punishment. Perhaps it was just fate. But it is Telegonus. So here are where's my notes? Some of the stories around the children and the death of Odysseus, right? Circe, Hesiod says, Circe, the daughter of Helios, loved Odysseus, of course, and bared for him Agrius, Latinus, and of course, Telegonus. Now, both of them were faultless and strong, okay? And Telegonus was brought forward by the will of golden Aphrodite, and they ruled over the famous Tyrrhenians very far off in the races of the Holy Land. So that's Hesiod's story. And then Telegonus is later told by Eugemon of Cyrene, for example, that when he learned that his mistake, which was he accidentally killed his father, he transports his father's body with Penelope and Telemachus, Telemachus being Odysseus's son with Penelope, to his mother's island, where Circe makes him immortal, and Telegonus marries Penelope and Telemachus Circe. So in a weird way, Eugemon of Cyrene tells us that after his own son kills him, Telegonus brings Penelope, which is like his stepmother, okay, and Telemachus, which is his stepbrother, to the island of Circe. And Telegonus marries Penelope, and Telemachus marries Circe. Very interesting. Yeah. Oppian later on in 3rd century CE explains to us that actually Circe had tipped the arrow the hilted spear of Telegonus in the poison of a stingray. And so that was just because she wanted to give him a defense in case somebody attacked him. Yeah. And so his long spear was filled with poison. And so in case he did have some kind of attack, he could survive. And he beached his ship on the island of pastured goats in Ithaca, where Odysseus was. And he knew not that he was harrying the flocks of his own father. So he didn't know that he was out there with the flocks of his father. And on his aged sire, who came to the rescue. So Odysseus thinks somebody is trying to take a few of his sheep or a few of his flocks. And he comes down and he's angry and he attacks Telegonus for taking some of his sheep. And Telegonus stabs him with the poisoned spear, neither of them knowing who the other is. And of course, Odysseus passes away. So there, the cunning Odysseus, who had passed through countless woes of the sea in his laborious adventures, The grievous stingray poison killed him with one blow. So a bit of a tragic end for Odysseus, you know. I'm not a fan of his very much. I don't know if anyone is a fan of him, perhaps in the old days. But still a weird way to go after such a long and tedious and violent and historical life, killed by his own son. But this does not technically count as patricide because neither know each other. And so the Furies then are not after Telegonus, and we are told that he ends up actually marrying his father's widow, which is Penelope. You know, so there's a bit of an interesting relationship there. Now, Circe does have a few lovers that I'm not sure that we're often told about. One of them, of course, are people she falls in love with or people she loves. One of them is Calchas. So Calchas is a Daunian, and he was greatly in love with her. The same one to which Odysseus came, so the same Circe. He handed over to her his kinship over the Daunians and employed all possible blandishments to gain her love. But she felt a passion for Odysseus, who was then with her, and loathed Calchas, okay, and forbade him to land on her island. However, he would not stop coming and could talk of nothing but Circe, and she, being extremely angry with him, laid a snare for him and had no sooner invited him into her palace, but she set before him a table covered with all manner of dainties. Of course, the meats and everything was full of magical drugs, and as soon as Calchas ate of them, he was stricken mad, and she drove him into the pigsties. After a certain time, though, the Daunians' army landed on the island to look for Calchas, and then she released him from the enchantment, first binding him by oath that he would never set foot on the island again, either to woo her or for any other purpose. So while Odysseus is there is a story of Calchas who shows up and he's falling in love with her and he's obsessed with her and he's stalking her. And so she turns him into a pig for a while, but then she has to turn him back and make him swear not to come back. Another person that she falls in love with, of course, we've talked about, no, sorry, we haven't talked about Picus. So Picus is a king, King Picus. And this comes from a story of someone who had been one of the men that were on Odysseus's boat, okay? And one of the nymphs that was there, he had spent a year with Circe, and one of the nymphs told him this story. So he says that this nymph points out to me one day while Circe dallied with my lord Odysseus, a statue of a youth in a snow-white marble, set in a shrine and gaily garlanded with many wreaths, who bore upon his head a woodpecker. So he asks, okay, who is this guy? And why worshipped in the shrine? And why is the bird upon his head? So the nymph says, I'll tell you the story. Yeah, this is King Picus, son of Saturnus. Okay, he ruled this island, blah blah. And he was very beautiful and he was very good looking. I'm summarizing. Yeah. And Picus left home one day to hunt some boars and roam the countryside and all this kind of stuff. And the same woods that, of course, Circe was also roaming. So they came upon each other. Yeah. And Circe saw the king and was dazed and entranced by him. Yeah. So entranced that she let the herbs fall out of her hand. Like blazing fire, a thrill of ecstasy raced through her veins. That's how beautiful King Picus was. And then she tried to chase him down, but she could not come to him because he rode so fast to get away from her and get back to his friends. So she says, you will not escape. No, though the wind will whirl you away, if I still know myself, if I still know my spells, their magic power will retain, and I will make some herbs that will make sure that you stay here. And then she tricks him. Long story short, she tricks him into thinking that he sees this wild boar. And then he follows this wild boar and he loses his guards and he loses everybody around him and he becomes totally, so she creates an illusion and becomes totally entranced by her. And then she tries to say, you have beautiful eyes. You've captured my eyes with your beauty. You're the loveliest of kings. It makes me here, a goddess, kneel to you, favor my passion, and accept as yours my father who sees all. and stay with me. I want you to stay with me. I want you to never go away. I'm in love with you, blah, blah. But fiercely, he repulses her and her plea, and he says, be whoever you are, but I am not yours. Someone else holds my heart, and many a year I pray shall hold it for a long time. Never will I wound, for any stranger's love my loyalty, while fate keeps my Canaan Jenna safe for me. Oh, that's a good name. Anyway, she pleads with him, and he says no, blah, blah, blah. And eventually she decides, okay, well, if you're not going to stay by your own will, then I'm going to make you into a bird. So she transmutes him into a bird. Okay. And of course, we have a little bit of a depiction of him being terrified of seeing himself turn into a bird in the same way that Scylla was terrified of seeing herself turn into a half monster. And then just like oh my goodness, I forgot his name. But just like other stories we've heard in the past, his comrades come to look for him, but they can't find him because, of course, he's a bird, and nobody can find him, and nobody knows where he is. And even his wife, his very, very sad wife, she stands there, apparently we're told, on the shore of her country or her village or town, watching with a heart in vain as she waits for her, watching with eyes and a heart in vain as she waits for her husband. However, nobody comes, nobody knows where she is. And in fact, his wife becomes so mad with grief, she rushes herself and roams the countryside of Latium, eventually wasting away and mourning. So Circe has a few lovers, and she doesn't like the answer no. We've seen her wrath when Glaucus denies her his love, and he says, no, I'm not in love with you, I'm in love with Scylla. And that's how poor Scylla becomes the monster that we talked about that she becomes. So Circe is in this way made to be very, very possessive, made to be very demanding, and you don't say no to Circe. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about her magic spells, all of the ways that she's described as having magic spells. So like we've talked about how she's the inventress of magic and spells, yeah, and she's said to invoke daemona or spirit magic. So that's that pharmakeia of herbs and healing and potions and vitamins and things. But she is also said to use sometimes a demonic spirit. Yeah. Remember that demons are just spirits. They're neither negative nor positive. So they're just based on the witch's intention. Okay. Homer does describe her, of course, as Circe the witch, who casts cruel spells, hurt men and all their handiwork. So that's one. Lycophron, for example, describes her as a beast molding Dracana, or a she-dragon, who mixes the drugs with her meal, and beast shaping doom that leads to beast shaping doom. So again, there's this concept of pharmakeia, which is the drugs being mixed, and also this concept of transformation or transmutation, which has a lot to do with the use of spirit. Pausanias also talks about her a little bit. He says that there are some scenes on a chest that he finds in Cypselus, which were dedicated at Olympia. And we're told that there is a grotto, and in it a woman is sleeping with a man upon a couch. And people say that these are Odysseus and Circe, resting together forever. And that handmaidens will go there and offer offerings in this cave. And so there's this long tradition of Circe, long after she's supposed to have been with Odysseus. I mean, yes, meant with Odysseus. And then there's this idea that she also creates these potions. She uses this plant, Molly, for example, of which Homer speaks. This plant was said to be grown from the blood of the gigante, or the giant, killed on the Isle of Circe. It was a white flower. In the alley of Circe, who killed the giant, was her father Helios. The combat was hard. And Helios was able to win this fight against the giant because Circe had given him this molly plant, or this molly. Blah, blah, blah. No, I'm telling that story wrong. I'm sorry. Once Helios had killed this giant, the blood of the giant grew the molly plant, and Circe uses that plant to create potions. Okay, so historically speaking, there are a couple of cults of Circe. There are a couple of places where we're told that their people practiced. This is, of course, during the 1st century BCE. So, for example, Strabo says that here off the coast of Attica, there are Pharmacusae, witch islands, two small islands on one of the larger of which is to be seen or to be found the tomb of Circe. Now, tomb is usually a shrine, and a shrine that's offered to a hero's cult. So there are a couple of islands in which people worship the goddess. Another one that we're told also by Strabo is that Circaeum, for example, in Italy, is a mountain which has the form of an island because it's surrounded by sea and marshes. They further say that Circaeum is a place that abounds in medicinal roots, perhaps because they associate it with the myth of Circe. It has a little city and a temple of Circe and an altar to Athena. And people there will show you a sort of bowl which they say belonged to Odysseus. So there's a few places in around the islands of Greece and, of course, Rome or Italy, where there have been some small temples or small mentions of Circe. And so it's interesting that she has this little bit of a cult, even during the sort of Greco-Roman Hellenistic period. Fast forward to today. So lastly, I'd like to talk to her about her a little bit in popular culture. So we've talked about the book Circe by Madeline Miller at the beginning of this podcast. And if you haven't read it, please go do read it if you're interested in historical fiction, because you really have to be into it. For me, historical fiction is more fun because I know the story. And so when someone retells a story in a fantastical way, I don't know, it's quite fascinating as long as they get the details right. And Madeline Miller certainly does. She certainly did her homework. The other really fascinating connection to Circe is, of course, Circe of Game of Thrones. And Circe of Game of Thrones is very much the traditional embodiment of Circe. She's not so much a witch per se, in the sense that she doesn't have her own powers of transmutation, certainly, but she does know her way around poisons, and she certainly knows her way around manipulating men, and certainly never regards them as equal. I was going to say other than her brother, but even then, never really regards them as equal, is constantly using them as a pawn in her play. If you watch Game of Thrones, then you totally know what I'm talking about in this. And even if you don't watch it, but you know who Circe is, she is a very modern figure that is influenced, I think, by the concept of Circe, without, like I said, the witchy powers. And my favorite thing I think about Circe, especially if you read the books, the books are pretty awesome. I would say 100% better than the film, but than the show. But if you read the books, you really see the duality of this character. And there are moments when you really can't stand her, and that's the same in the show. And then there are moments when you really start to understand her. So really beautifully written, but I think very much that sort of complexity of women and men, but the complexity of humans, but complexity of this character and of this individual. And then I've just learned there is a Circe in the DC universe. So if you're not watching this on YouTube and you want to look up Circe in the DC universe, there is a powerful figure, superhero, villainess, however you want to look at her, of Circe in the DC universe, which is awesome. It's not actually something that I know, even though I do enjoy comic books, but I'm not, I guess, as well versed as I thought I was, because I'd never seen Circe before. And so again, she has made it into popular culture fantastically. And my favorite thing about the DC universe is that she has red hair, because like we talked about previously, for a long time, witches were seen as having red hair, or anybody with red hair was seen as possibly being a witch, or born from a witch, or that kind of thing. And so DC universe obviously uses this old relic of a red hair assumption. Yeah. So Circe continues to fascinate us, and continues to be a story that we are revisiting. I guess in some ways, I think Madeline Miller does an amazing job at filling in the gap. In some ways, one of the sad parts about Circe is that in some ways we have a lot of detail, but we don't have enough detail. And so we have a story, but the story is detailed enough that people, I don't think, for a long time felt the need to really add to it. They sort of read it and thought, okay, this is who she is. And I think that now we are starting to revisit that, as we're starting to revisit many villainesses and many goddesses, and ask ourselves, is there more to the story, and what has been left out? And so I hope that you find her as fascinating a figure as I found her. We really didn't have the time to talk about the ways in which witchcraft operates throughout, let's say, the last 3, 4, 5,000 years, because that would take an entire season. But I want to leave you with this idea of this concept of perspective. And of course, you know what perspective is, but this concept that the way that we think about witches today has been so deeply, purposely indoctrinated by Western Christian thought that we find it very difficult to let go of that perspective and create our own perspective, which is that someone who may have, let's say, magical powers, and I say that in quotation in the sense of may use energies or vibrations or potions or healing or whatever it is that they have, or they're prophetic, or they're psychic, or etc. And that the tool itself, the magic itself, the sorcery itself is neither good nor evil, but it's the person that's, of course, using that defines the purpose of that magic. And I just say that in closing because I know that we come out of a Harry Potter world, and so there are a lot of people out there that are like, of course magic is awesome, and that's wonderful, but there is still a lot of backlash, and for a long time practicing witches had to hide, of course, and Wiccans, for a long time they called themselves Wiccans, not so much witches, in order to sort of avoid the negativity that came with the word witches and the stereotypes. And I think that now they're taking back that word witch and they're embracing those traditions, and all of those traditions are earth-based, which is of course why Circe is such a gardener, right? I mean, she's a gardener and a farmer. I mean, those are really her foundational tools, right? She's raising animals and she's raising crops. And so, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, except I just want us to maybe adjust our perspective so that we can freely use the word witch without all of the negative connotations. Yeah. So if anything, I hope that this podcast has showing you a couple of different aspects of both Circe and also witchery. And I also hope that you enjoy the stories, the ancient stories, which I think is still fascinating. I saw something today that said, why are ancient stories still so fascinating? And I think that might be a whole podcast. Why are we so fascinated with myth? And there's so much to say about that, but I think it's a good question. So I'm going to leave you on that with that question. Why are we so fascinated with myth? It's not just entertainment. There is something deeper for us. There is a passion, a pull that we all feel, and we want to talk about it, and we want to share about it, and we almost privately wish that we could really believe in it in the way that the ancients did. Perhaps there's answers there. Perhaps we're looking for answers. And there are people who do truly and faithfully believe. And I think more and more people are waking up to that faith. But again, it's a fascinating question. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. Please like, subscribe, share, follow. If you're on Spotify, please hit that 5-star review if you really like this podcast. It helps a lot. And please feel free to leave me your comments or DM me on Instagram or wherever. If you have any questions or any thoughts about this or anything comes to mind that you want to discuss, I'm here always to talk about goddesses and ancient history. All right. Have a great day. I'll see you next week for Medea. Thank you again for being here. Goodbye.